personally see any changes during this year, like regards all these unfortunate events during war or crisis, like beginning of economical crisis? Maybe you see some changes in the environment and how companies decided to do that way or other way. So maybe you can add something in that area also, that topic.
I mean, in general, I think the cloud will continue to be a cornerstone and will only continue to grow regardless of what's happening in society, unless we have economic collapse, right? I mean, in all honesty, when we begin to think about, when we really begin to think about it, in order for any organization to compete, they need commoditization of infrastructure, for example. So nominally, the cloud will provide us with automated ways of deploying infrastructure, so we can begin to deploy, so we can drive workloads across it, right? No matter how we slice it. And as organizations grow, or even as more and more organizations continue to come into being, meaning they're created, that need will still be there, no matter what happens, right? Like I said, unless there's an economic crisis that is global. But I do see that need for cloud not slowing down over the next several years. In fact, I see it continuously increasing as more and more companies come into being, and we continue to drive capitalization at a global level. As long as those factors are there, we'll continue to need the cloud, and we'll continue to need the cloud nominally from an infrastructure perspective, because it's just a commoditization. Even if you take a small local dry cleaner, right? While they may not need a cloud infrastructure, they'll at least need a level of functional business systems to track payroll, just as a simple example, right?
Yeah.
And those offerings, being in the cloud, exist. And so the reality is why would I make an investment on-prem for that need when I can go to an off-prem solution, even for a small business? That it doesn't even have to be a technology business. It could be a simple convenience store with multiple employees, right? But as our our economy continues to grow globally, which it is, and our capitalism continues to grow globally, that off-prem cloud environment will continue to be there.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Maybe some more thoughts
about that.
Yeah, I can maybe just come in very quickly. I think you kind of mentioned hostile and sort of areas of conflict that might sort of make us think twice about putting stuff in the cloud. I think up to a certain degree, obviously, that's down to the cloud provider and their sort of service and your sort of level of agreement that you have with them. But also, just putting stuff in the cloud doesn't mean you can't have a backup and recovery strategy and a DR strategy, a disaster recovery strategy. Those still need to be implemented. Cloud data management helps with that, as I mentioned earlier, but you still need to implement that and obviously test that. Should you need to pull your data out of a particular area or a particular platform, or geographically something's happening in a particular area that's kind of causing adverse effects to your business. So even though you're in the cloud, you still need to have a strategy for backup and recovery, and also still need to have a strategy for disaster recovery, whatever that might be. I mean, it might be just going back to pen and paper. If that's kind of your DR strategy, fair enough. That's kind of where you are in your business, and actually reverting back to pen and paper for something, that's kind of how it's going to work for you, and that's fine. And I've actually read news stories recently where the cloud availability wasn't there or something, or the system, somebody's data center was hacked or something like that, and were held to ransom, so they actually reverted to pen and paper to pay their staff, for example. So you need to have something in place, is what I would say, and that's regardless of whether you're in the data center, definitely in the data center, and definitely in the cloud. And again, Cloud Center of Excellence really kind of drives that strategy, also be driving that strategy and making the decisions for that.
Thank you very much. Marius, any thoughts also? Maybe?
Yes. Well, Richard, you picked up my topics because it's exactly what I wanted to talk about the situation that actually I found with my other hat, speaking with my MVP colleagues about cases of Ukrainian companies who left their data center completely being destroyed, and they moved very quickly to the public cloud in that situation. And so the public cloud was the opportunity for that, and it's one of the consequences of the war, of course, and for all the others to think on. We should really have multiple premises for important applications and have in mind disaster recovery plans and fast switch of premises if needed for these critical applications in particular. And yes, we are closer, I would say, to that situation when, yes, you have a disaster recovery plan only in case of, we're closer to that case of right now because of the war. Another thing which changed not only with the war, but with the whole last years, I would say, but the war accelerated that, are the security concerns. Because we are all of us subject to multiple attacks, and we know that many of them come from the opposite part of the road, I would say. No matter it's Russia, Iran, or China, or other countries, or not necessarily governmental organizations, but individual groups which are, very, very active nowadays. And so we really need to be to leverage, of course, more and more bricks from the cloud service providers, more integrated ways, more intelligent ways to detect the threats, and apply that in our production environments. And so these are the key things I would wanted to add. One more is that this kind of brutal changes may give us, also in conjunction with the COVID crisis, I would say, that we are often dependent of external factors. And once again, let me have the same expression of saying we are, quote, on the good part of the road, having the cloud service providers, which are American, most of the hyperscalers are American, and so we are in the good data centers right now, I would say, in that extent, in the public cloud. Let's have in mind still that, speaking of situation of Taiwan, we are so much dependent on semiconductors still today, and that will lead further to dependencies in availability of services within cloud data centers, and with the prices that may change also. So we have to have in mind all these factors which may impact in unattended ways our day-to-day business, I would say.
Yeah, there's two things you said there, Marius, that I thought were incredibly interesting, especially the one where you're talking about we have to come up with better ways to prevent being hacked, right? And that's where I really see ML AI ops come in to make a significant difference in the cloud. And from a cloud provider perspective, those kinds of organizations that are driving ML and AI ops with their offering makes a substantial competitive difference. The other thing that you had mentioned was around the sort of the competitive nature of well, I shouldn't say the competitive nature of COVID. And one of the things I find very, very interesting, for better or for worse, is when we just look at where we are from an information sharing perspective and from a data sharing perspective, the technologies that we have in place today, which were primarily driven from a cloud-based perspective, if we didn't have those technologies in place, this global pandemic would have lasted many, many more years. Even if you rewind 10 years ago, even if you take the pandemic to where we are today and go back 10 years, based on where we are today, we were able to reduce this to a couple of years. If you go back 10 years or even 15 years, the pandemic would have lasted a significantly longer time, just simply based on the amount of data sharing that we're able to do. And a lot of that is facilitated through our cloud environment. So I thought those were very interesting points and just wanted to elaborate on those a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, it is really interesting when we start talking not just as like regular pros and cons, but about something which is really happening right now, and like couple last years. Actually, I have a question about, I think it's more to Richard, about preventing some dangerous incidents like security breaches or something else if you go fully cloud. So, for example, this is like small company which is like going cloud, as you said, and how they can prevent like these security problems they can.
Sure. I would say you need to go back to the shared responsibility model. So the public cloud provider offers you security in terms of where you store stuff and so on, but it doesn't secure the actual data, it doesn't secure the actual workload. So if any of your workloads are public facing, so they need to communicate with the outside world, whether it's a web server or whatever it is, all of that still requires security. Now the thing to remember then, obviously there are tools both from the public cloud provider and third party sort of standalone tools or open source tools that you can use to help you secure your workloads, as well as the infrastructure that you're building. So Marius mentioned things like a Kubernetes cluster. Again, there is security for that. There's security for the containers or the microservices that might be running in that Kubernetes cluster in terms of how they communicate. So the major things to consider, and I kind of always try to point this out to customers, is when you go from data center to cloud, in regards to kind of what your decisions were and reasons, the two major things that ultimately change are your security and your connectivity or networking. So you're kind of going from a castle and moat sort of approach in the data center, host-based, static IP, Active Directory sort of service accounts, to a zero trust environment in the cloud, with service registries, secrets managers, encryption, and ephemeral workloads. So that's kind of all the type of things that organizations need to consider, and that's obviously what we provide advice on for them. So and again, final just point on the security aspect. So shared responsibility model, you got to kind of do your side of it as well as an enterprise. And using those kind of tools, and those tools change from the data center. Don't go and kind of implement your usual data center stuff in the cloud. That's not going to work. The other thing to really remember, and this is, I think, very much misused and sometimes abused, as well as, the terms like cybersecurity, for example. Security is multiple layers, and you really got to look at that, at all of those layers in the cloud, and make sure that you have a strategy, around how you do that security in the cloud. And again, there'll be tools that might be, from the public cloud provider, if that kind of makes sense, and you can make use of that, and that allows you to accelerate your sort of time to market. Great, go and use those for now, and maybe you can kind of get off those in 18 months time or whatever. But there's also obviously commercial tools that you can get from vendors that offer their tools in the public cloud, as well as open source tools. So if you have the skills within your organization to do that, then you can obviously roll your own as well. But security in the cloud is multiple layers, and I would say you need to kind of look at all of those when you're doing anything in terms of your strategy for security in the cloud.
Thank you very much. Actually, we're planning like different discussion about security in clouds, like with a bunch of our speakers. So I think we'll dive deep into this topic a bit later, I think in a month or two. So we have a question from our audience. They asked us to touch commercial aspect of cloud versus on-premises. As mentioned, it is shift from CapEx to OpEx, but also difficult to predict OpEx. Operational expenses is really difficult to predict, I think.
I can probably maybe just come in very quickly on that again. It's obviously, it is a shift, as I said earlier in our talk. I think my sort of response to the prediction of that is that you can predict it better in the cloud than you can necessarily in the data center. And if you're really have your sort of cloud implementation and strategy, well thought out and well designed, then you should be able to cater for and anticipate any issues that may occur, both from DR and sort of recovery sort of process that we discussed earlier, but also from a scaling out. So you're kind of a retailer and you're sort of being hit over Christmas time because there's more demands on your website and so on, then you should be able to scale that environment out very quickly. And you could even, to a degree, if you trust the environment enough and you kind of have the knowledge enough to actually automate that process. So again, observability tools such as the kind of the Cure and various other ones can actually give you the metrics that you need to see that there is a greater demand. Maybe it's kind of around Christmas time and lots of people are hitting your website to buy various whatever goods and things like that, presents and so on. So you get that sort of alert, that event information from an observability platform, and that could automate the request or the directive to your Kubernetes environment, and your Kubernetes environment will scale out automatically. So you can take it to that degree. You could also include some manual human sort of gates, if you like, along that process to make the decisions manually if you want to do that. But scaling out is the way to actually deal with that sort of the sort of anticipation or those kind of areas where you're not kind of expecting a requirement, a higher requirement for your service. So as long as you have that designed and that's part of your architecture, then cloud, I would say, is kind of can cope with that infinitely better.
Yeah, I'd add on to that. The question is 100% correct. The reality is, though, when you think about CapEx versus OpEx, it all comes back to the mindset that your business is in and how they're willing to spend money. Most financial controllers don't want to potentially spend money for something that they might have a problem with, right? You might need to scale, or you might have a need for infrastructure. They like it definitively, and that's where the CapEx piece comes into play. And that's where you start getting into yearly budgets, which, in all honesty, who can actually predict in a year what they're going to need financially, right? And that's to be frank, a very, very old. Well, it's still in play today, but it's a very, very old mindset, right? In reality, trying to drive that OpEx budget based on, like Richard said, observability, really will help put a fine point on when you might need that money and why you might need that money, and will allow your financial controllers to have a much better understanding of where they're going to spend that money based on some level of historical data and information, which will begin to pull them away from that CapEx model and much more into that OpEx model.
Thank you, Marius.
Yes, that's interesting because this, in theory, takes you back to the advantage of being on premises. On premises, uh, all the costs are clear. You know how much you invest at the beginning. You know how much it will cost. Whether when you go to the cloud, I have a serverless server service. How many calls I'll have, what traffic I'll have on the network to see the peering consumption and what's the cadence of logs that will be ingested and how much and so on. So these are the things that are so complicated in the cloud, and everyone's complaining that they're not capable actually to anticipate all that. What's behind that is that actually there are two things actually coming together, hopefully at some point in time. First of all, the way of calculating the cost on premises hides actually, uh, you know, uh, a very the very rough estimation that um, the application owners are capable to do in order for the applications to run. And so in that extent they will simply make you know the 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 the, the safest calculation to say, yeah, I need this kind of number of servers and so on and so on. At the end of the line, it hides a lot of cost that could have been optimized. So the big difference is, yes, I know how much it cost me, but it will be more that it should cost me actually, typically. On the other side, on the cloud, uh, there are many. Yeah, the cloud is so nice. And once again, as a Azure MVP, I know the greatness of the public cloud. Uh, but when you have the surprise at the end of the month to have, I don't know how many thousands of euros of consumption simply on a logs workspace, you're saying it must be nuts. Can be true. So the thing is that some service providers, cloud service providers, do start adapting their model of consumption to be a bit closer to a predictable one. I mean, they go, for example, for database consumption, uh, go back to a core-based model consumption, which is more predictable, more simple to calculate at the end. That's not feasible for all the situations because you'll have still serverless services and consumption of resources like egress bandwidth and things like that. But we're going to a hopefully more predictable model with a better calculators, uh, which eventually will help you predict better uh, your consumption in the public cloud. The last point is, in any case, it's your application. If you are really the master of your application, if you know it so well, you should be able to calculate estimatedly how many calls from how many customers you'll have, how many calls you'll have per month, and what the bandwidth that you'll consume and everything. So this is finally the key point.
Yeah, I would say just add one extra point on that is for kind of that sort of level of predictability in terms of your costs and consumption, and also to look at it from a cost reduction point of view, which incidentally also leads you directly into a kind of a greener implementation of your services in the cloud, because it's having less services and running, consuming less of the cloud means that you're actually more green as well. So it's a kind of a direct of that is looking at certainly a kind of infrastructure as code and serverless and things like that, which help you kind of with those sorts of predictions, because you can obviously provision those services and as and when you need them, and you can scale existing services as and when you need them, as we kind of gave the sort of the Christmas example, and when it's kind of more demand. But the way to really get the finance sort of governed properly is to implement FinOps as part of your strategy. So again, we go back to Cloud Center of Excellence and having them to actually look at FinOps, getting your finance team, your CFO involved in that process to look at actually how you can control your costs, and also put gates and gateways and things like that that help you to mitigate any sort of issues that you have in terms of overspending and things like that. And that can be both for sort of the human factor, where developers are just kind of dropping stuff into a public cloud and kind of using more resources, but also as well as the automated platforms where they're kind of looking to scale out. And again, there's FinOps policies that you can apply as part of that process. So FinOps is the kind of the approach to do that.
If I could add one point on that, I totally agree with you with your FinOps methodology and practicing. One of the key points that can be done actually is to have in place, and some of the organizations put that in place, technical or also not only technical mechanisms within the cloud, which would say include policies to control either security criteria or compliance criteria or FinOps criteria or resilience criteria. This kind of engine of control of the global compliance of the cloud usage is very useful. It's not necessarily cheap to implement, but it will be very helpful on the long run with different teams that will be much easier onboarded and will be automatically, I would say, accompanied to go on the straight road to the cloud.
Thanks a lot for all your thoughts. And we have, I think, only a couple of questions to add. And first would be about how would you run the on-prem versus cloud assessment? We talked a bit about it, but maybe we can summarize somehow for enterprise application implementation. So maybe just briefly we can summarize what we said about it.
I can certainly offer something around that. I mean, I think there's obviously a certain approach that you would take in terms of doing a sort of an assessment. Again, I think this is very much the responsibility of the likes of your competency center or your Cloud Center of Excellence to kind of make those decisions. But the overall decision, is not really that. The overall decision is, whether you kind of want to go to cloud. And if you are going to go to cloud, then you'd probably look at existing applications that you have in the data center and look at, as well as the data that's attached to those, to actually migrate those into the cloud. That assessment is a standard thing that's done. You can certainly go to the public cloud providers, but also the likes of T-Systems. We run those types of assessments to help customers first of all appreciate what they have in the data center, look at all the workloads, and we go to very, very fine, minute detail on each of those applications, and we do that with our customers, and then we make decisions on which applications are the appropriate candidates to start with, and then we go through the process of what each of those applications requires to be migrated to the cloud. Is there codes changes? Is there configuration changes? Is it reliant on certain peripheral files and runtimes and things like that. So all of that's really taken into account. And really where you go into the cloud, so I said there's multiple stages that you can go into the cloud. This is very much dependent, again, on what strategy you've decided initially, and maybe you've kind of having or you've decided like a two-step strategy where you kind of just go into infrastructure as code to begin with, and then think about containerization and serverless and and DevOps and things like that. And that might come as a stage 2 or a stage 3 and a sort of migration for you. So some customers go straight into, as I said, sort of stage 3, stage 4 sort of approach, where they kind of start changing the way that they develop applications. They go from waterfall method to an agile method and use DevOps sort of methodologies, and and also stage 4 kind of do more serverless infrastructure as code and things like that, and microservices. But others actually are kind of a little bit more cautious in terms of their approach, maybe because they need their IT team to kind of skill up as well. This is a cultural change as well as a technology change for any enterprise. It's not just changing one type of technology for another. It's also a cultural shift as well. So assessments are certainly done when you migrate. Assessments in terms of whether this should end up in the data center or the cloud will depend on your policy and what your CCOE has agreed.
Thank you. Maybe some other thoughts?
I was just going to add to that driven by the business. I mean, that would be the only big thing I'd add there. And when you peel back and you look at from a business value perspective, what are you really trying to drive? That will definitely begin to break down into what Richard was talking about. And it's interesting because organizations make conscious efforts to use on-prem versus off-prem and build out their own cloud environment. And I guess the question becomes, why? What's the business value that's driving that? And it might be, like we talked about earlier, well, I've got all of this investment in capital. Why am I going to waste this? And I'll build out my own cloud center of excellence and do that on-prem and focus that there versus driving it on-prem. But I totally agree with Richard's general assessment from a tactical perspective, for sure.
Yes, thank you. Marius, maybe also.
Yes, in regards to the assessment approach, definitely this would be we mentioned a lot of criteria that should be put in this assessment in regards to all the aspects we discussed in the call. At the end, we should have a decision tree which will tell the application to rehost, to replatform, to refactor, maybe to remove if we're moving to another solution. And by these choices, we will have also a clear direction whether to go to the public cloud, to the private cloud, to a traditional infrastructure. And yeah, I believe all this is at some point well structured with, as Richard said, the Cloud Center of Excellence guidance. And from that moment, you go with this structured approach to mass migration. But you'd have to go through this, a very structured discussion with the assessment and have all the good criteria, which some of them are, very generic, found in every, typical assessment, but you may have some specific criteria to your organization. So you need to see that in your context in regards to the business model, as Adam said, and build your own particular decision tree as for your organization. It can fit maybe depending on the situation. If it's for very simple organizations or very recent ones, you may simply take an assessment sheet from Microsoft or Amazon and go ahead with. Okay, but essentially, if you have a more complex organization with much more criteria and the situations, you have to adjust your assessment, and at the end, you have this decision tree which guide you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that right now it's really clear how to like implement the assessment and go to the cloud or on-prem, because we like really cover so much criteria on that topic. So it is, I hope that it's clear for our attendee who asked that question also. And I have two last questions. I would like to like briefly wrap up our conversation, but I can't like, I can't ask it. How do you monitor your environment, your infrastructure? Because you have like different approaches, as we see, and which solutions do you apply to monitor your infrastructure? Can you please share maybe some names, maybe not, maybe some approaches you would like to share also with us in that case? Because me actually interested personally, how do you do on-prem monitoring or hybrid monitoring, hybrid cloud monitoring? So I'm just really curious.
Well, there's lots of different, if we're speaking more about tooling, right? There's lots of different tools out there that can,
Yep.
some are commercially available right off the shelf. We use combinations of tools, and through our SRE team, who primarily does all of our or any of our monitoring for any of our cloud-based applications that we run. We use various things like Prometheus, Nagios, and other observability tools to begin to help us obtain the information we need in order to react and respond to various notification systems. But it all depends on how much money you're willing to spend, and and what you're trying to accomplish from a notification or an observability and reliability system. We had some very, very call them customized use cases, which is why we went down the path we went down. But if you don't have necessarily customized use cases, you can use something available, open source, commercially available off the shelf.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe some others.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a fundamental difference. I pointed out sort of security and connectivity being sort of different from what you had in the data center versus in the public cloud. It's a similar story, I think, for general sort of monitoring, as it's called. I think that's kind of the general umbrella term, and then within that is things like observability platforms. Adam mentioned a few of those sort of open source ones, like the Prometheus, Grafana, etc., which kind of you can build your sort of environment based around those. If you have that sort of skill set and you have the sort of the teams, or you can obviously go for the public cloud providers sort of tools. They provide a plethora of tools that help with the entire sort of cloud environment. They even actually stretch beyond their own. And we were talking about multi-cloud. Now they can actually support multiple sort of cloud platforms as well. The vendors are kind of coming in as part of that as well. So going back to what Marius said about sort of Kubernetes and so on, there is that sort of layer where, again, you can monitor all of your sort of Kubernetes, clusters, but also go multi-cloud if you have that, and multi-version as well. So kind of Kubernetes from vendor A and Kubernetes from vendor B. Both of those can be managed by the Kubernetes sort of management platform from vendor A, for example. So again, I've seen that quite a lot in the last 18 months, and I think that's only goodness in this sort of whole space. The differences are that you're going from a systems management sort of environment to an observability environment. So systems management is kind of really focused on looking at the applications from the outside in. So you have like agents and things like that monitor applications and services and processes and so on. Whereas really observability is looking at it from the inside out. So from the inside, the cloud native application, if that's what that's what you've developed and that's what you've deployed in the cloud, will include a number of parameters that basically help you to monitor that application, as well as do other things as well in that sort of monitoring sort of space. So your observability platform is looking at metrics, logs, and traces. Those are the kind of the three sort of parameters. I call that MELT for short. So uppercase M, lowercase e, and then uppercase L and uppercase T, because I can never, apart from that, I can never remember them. So MELT for short works for me, and otherwise I get
nice.
confused. Yes, that was just something I came up with, and I just thought, wow, that actually works. That's great. I can now remember metrics, logs, and traces. Otherwise, I can't. Anyway, so observability, platforms look at that. The great thing with those, and I have pressed a number of sort of observability vendors on this, is what is the AI and ML aspect of your platform actually doing? What is it that you're actually providing? And I think the ideas, this was when I kind of worked at IBM, we had a number of sort of systems management tools, and we kind of did start the ideas of kind of doing this back then. It wasn't kind of called AI and ML in those days, but this kind of predictability and the ability to point patterns or to identify patterns in failures and problems and things like that. So that's kind of really where, so that sort of observability, we're using things like AI ops, for example, would really kind of come into it and help the ops teams and the SREs, site reliability engineering teams, to kind of do their job. From the inside, it would be things like chaos engineering, actually building into your code failures, so the way to actually break applications, and that's what chaos engineering will do. It will actually deliberately go and break certain parts of your application to see how resilient it is and how your entire service for that application will cope. So that looks at kind of essentially how you've architected that service in the cloud. And obviously, if it fails completely, it didn't do a good job, so we go back to the drawing board and kind of improve on that. But if it did cope with that, that's great. And then we kind of see how we can replicate that success elsewhere as well, and kind of use that as a blueprint, if you like, for developing applications. So chaos engineering from the inside, AI ops, again, kind of looking again from the inside on metrics, logs, and traces. And yeah, that differs kind of from how we used to do things in the data center using systems management tools, which are kind of looking at applications from the outside in.
Thank you very much. Yes. Marius, maybe also some thoughts.
Yes, I won't enter it now. I won't be so exhaustive. Maybe, especially that I won't be able to, let's say, disclose the exact products that we're using in the company. But as a principle, the approach and the tendency is to use definitely the open source frameworks for logging and diagnostics, and when they are also implemented as managed services by the cloud service providers, it's even better, because we have the managed service, and at the same time it's an open platform, so we can be at any moment compatible, and we can extract the data and move elsewhere if needed, and so on. So and this is essentially the approach, the tendency we're seeing of using as much as possible managed services for monitoring, logging, diagnostics in the public cloud, but having this also opportunity to be compatible to external tools. And last particular point in that is that in a multi-cloud environment, the initial concern of be sure not to depend exclusively on one platform becomes very concrete when you're saying that I have a very good tool in one of the public cloud providers, which helps you consolidate all the logs and give me maybe a very good CM as a solution, so that I can analyze those logs and do everything. It sounds so wonderful, except when this CM won't be available for some reason and for duration of time. So in that moment, all your 3 clouds are actually unavailable from this functionality perspective. So we have to be very, very careful on this kind of dependencies and ensure maybe different approaches with not complete dependencies on one particular cloud, and ensure, for example, for the private cloud, maybe its own implementation, even if it costs more than if we would use a single platform centralized.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that we would wrap up our conversation. This was really beautiful discussion, and actually, I think I wrote down a lot of thoughts, a lot of to think about, like to the future. So thanks a lot, and I hope that our audience also enjoy our conversation. And I need to say that we would send the recordings to every attendee who have been registered. And thanks a lot, our amazing speakers, to each of you, because your experience, your thoughts is really priceless from different set of perspectives. But also I can say that we, I think, agreed on so many topics. So we can see like the blueprints in the industry, actually, at least in the enterprise companies, and it is great also because we don't argue too much. So actually it was pretty nice and simple to moderate your session. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Happy
everyone.
to discuss to every one of you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.